In a fiery address from the Oval Office this evening, President Donald J. Trump declared his intention to deploy U.S. troops to West Africa with the explicit goal of dissolving the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, arresting its key leaders, and restoring what he described as true democracy to the nations of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The announcement, delivered amid rising tensions in the Sahel region, marks a dramatic escalation in U.S. foreign policy and has already sparked international outcry, with critics labeling it a potential violation of sovereignty and a throwback to interventionist eras. Trump, speaking directly to the camera in a 15-minute nationally televised speech, painted the AES as a rogue cartel of dictators that poses an existential danger not only to regional stability but to the very principles of democratic governance worldwide. These so-called leaders in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have hijacked their countries, kicked out the good guys, and are building a fortress against freedom, Trump asserted, his voice rising with characteristic emphasis. They're a threat to democracy, our democracy, their democracy, everybody's democracy. We're going in, we're dissolving this AES nonsense, arresting the ringleaders, and making sure democracy is restored. Big League. The AES, formerly known as the Alliance des États du Sahel, was established in September 2024 by the military juntas of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso following a series of coups that ousted democratically elected governments between 2020 and 2023. Led by figures such as Mali's Colonel Assimi Goïta, Niger's General Abdourahmane Tiani, and Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traore, the alliance was formed as a mutual defense and economic pact after the three nations withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, amid sanctions and threats of military intervention. Proponents of the AES argue it represents a push for African sovereignty, free from Western influence, particularly from former colonial power France, whose troops were expelled from the region in recent years. Critics, however, including the U.S. State Department under previous administrations, have accused the alliance of suppressing dissent, aligning with Russian mercenaries like the Wagner Group, now Africa Corps, and exacerbating jihadist insurgencies through poor governance. Delving into the president's rationale, Trump elaborated on the perceived threats during his speech, drawing parallels to historical U.S. interventions. He claimed that the AES governments have rigged elections, silenced the press, and let terrorists run wild, allowing groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS to flourish in the vast Sahel desert. Democracy must be restored to Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, not some fake version where warlords call the shots, Trump said, invoking the memory of U.S. operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. He specifically highlighted reports of human rights abuses, including arbitrary detentions and crackdowns on pro-democracy protests, as evidence that the AES is exporting chaos that could spill over into Europe and even threaten American interests through migration and terrorism networks. Sources within the White House, speaking on condition of anonymity, revealed that the decision stems from months of intelligence briefings warning of deepening Russian and Chinese influence in the region. The AES nations have pivoted toward Moscow for military support and Beijing for infrastructure deals, including mining rights to vast uranium and gold reserves in Niger and Burkina Faso. Trump, who has long criticized multilateral organizations like the United Nations for inaction, dismissed calls for diplomatic solutions through ECOWAS or the African Union. Talk is cheap, action wins, he quipped, announcing that U.S. Special Forces and drone units would lead the initial phase, with potential involvement from NATO allies if needed. The speech included vivid details on the operational plan, though military specifics remained classified. Trump outlined a multi-pronged approach. First, targeted airstrikes to disrupt AES command structures. Second, ground troops to secure key capitals like Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. And third, the installation of interim governments handpicked for their love of freedom. He vowed to arrest leaders like Goïta, Tiani, and Traore, whom he referred to as thugs in uniforms, and bring them to face justice, possibly in The Hague or U.S. courts. No more safe havens for anti-democratic forces, Trump declared, emphasizing that the intervention would be swift and total to minimize civilian casualties. Reactions poured in immediately following the address. In West Africa, protests erupted in AES capitals, with supporters of the juntas burning American flags and chanting against neocolonialism. ECOWAS issued a cautious statement urging restraint, while French President Emmanuel Macron, whose country maintains economic ties in the region, expressed deep concern over unilateral U.S. action. On the international stage, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov condemned the announcement as imperialist aggression, vowing to defend AES sovereignty. Chinese state media echoed similar sentiments, accusing Trump of using democracy as a pretext for resource grabs. Domestically, the speech has divided opinion. Republican lawmakers hailed it as a bold stand against authoritarianism, with House Speaker Mike Johnson praising Trump's decisive leadership. Democrats, however, decried it as reckless warmongering. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called for immediate congressional oversight, warning that this could drag us into another endless war. Anti-war groups mobilized protests outside the White House, drawing comparisons to the 2003 Iraq invasion. As Pentagon officials prepare for deployment, questions swirl about the legal basis for the intervention. The White House cites the authorization for use of military force, AUMF, from 2001, expanded to cover global terrorism threats, but legal experts argue it may not apply to state actors like the AES. Furthermore, the economic stakes are immense. The Sahel region holds critical minerals essential for green energy transitions, and U.S. companies have eyed opportunities there amid the pivot away from Russian supplies. With troops potentially mobilizing within days, the world watches as this unfolds into what could be one of the most controversial foreign policy moves of Trump's second term. The full implications for U.S.-Africa relations, global alliances, and the fragile Sahel security landscape remain uncertain, as diplomatic channels strain under the weight of impending conflict. Mere hours after President Donald J. Trump's Oval Office address threatening U.S. military intervention in West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the 35-year-old leader of Burkina Faso and a key architect of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, delivered a blistering rebuttal in a live broadcast from the presidential palace. Flanked by military aides and AES representatives from Mali and Niger via video link, Traore systematically dismantled Trump's allegations, framing the U.S. president's threats as the latest chapter in a long history of Western meddling in African affairs. His defiant words, laced with anti-colonial rhetoric, have ignited a firestorm across the continent, rallying supporters while drawing sharp rebukes from Western capitals. In a 20-minute speech aired on state television and streamed across social media platforms, Traore addressed Trump's claims point by point, beginning with the accusation that the AES represents a threat to democracy. "We are here for the people, and democracy is for the people," Traore declared, his voice steady and commanding, echoing the chants of crowds gathered outside the palace. He argued that the AES governments were not imposed dictatorships but organic responses to the failures of previous regimes, which he labeled as puppets installed and propped up by Western powers, including the United States and France. "The people put us here, not by your rigged elections, but by the afflictions caused by your puppets," he said, referencing the economic hardships, corruption scandals, and security breakdowns that preceded the coups in Burkina Faso, 2022, Mali, 2020 to 2021, and Niger, 2023. Traore pointed to widespread protests and public support for the juntas as evidence of a people's mandate, contrasting it with what he called the illusion of democracy under leaders who prioritized foreign interests over local needs. Delving deeper into his defense, Traore highlighted specific grievances against Western-backed governments. He cited the case of Burkina Faso's ousted President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, whom he accused of allowing French mining companies to exploit gold reserves while jihadist groups like Jamaat Nasser al-Islam wal Muslimin, JNIM, terrorized rural communities unchecked. "Your puppets let terrorists thrive because they were too busy filling their pockets with your aid money," Traore charged, referencing U.S. intelligence reports, ironically, from Trump's own administration, that had criticized Kabore's handling of the insurgency. Similarly, in Niger, he defended General Abdourahmane Tiani's takeover by pointing to the mismanagement of uranium exports, where French firm Orano, formerly Areva, held a near monopoly, leaving locals in poverty despite the resource wealth. "Democracy. Your version means our children starve while you power your cities with our uranium," he said, invoking images of environmental degradation and child labor in mining sites. Traore then turned to the broader ideological battle, asserting that no external force could override popular will. "No one can stop the will of the people," he proclaimed, drawing applause from the assembled crowd. He positioned the AES as a bulwark against neocolonialism, emphasizing its withdrawal from ECOWAS and expulsion of French troops as steps toward true sovereignty. "So, Donald Trump, to hell with your threats," Traore said directly, staring into the camera with unflinching resolve. We are here to liberate Africa from your grip of exploitations and neocolonialism and your brutal, self-claimed policing. He elaborated on this by recounting historical parallels. U.S. support for apartheid-era regimes in southern Africa, interventions in Libya that led to regional destabilization, and recent arms deals with ECOWAS nations that he claimed were aimed at encircling the AES. Traore accused Trump of hypocrisy, noting the former president's own criticisms of endless wars during his first term, yet now proposing another intervention for what he called resource control disguised as democracy promotion. The speech delved into the AES's achievements to counter Trump's portrayal of chaos. Traore touted security gains, such as joint operations that reclaimed territory from Islamist militants, and economic reforms like nationalizing key industries and forging ties with Russia and China for non-exploitative partnerships. Under your puppets, debt soared and terrorists multiplied. Now, with the People's Army, we're building schools, roads, and alliances that serve Africans first, he said, citing statistics from AES reports. A 20% drop in terrorist incidents in coordinated zones and new trade pacts that bypassed Western sanctions. He also addressed human rights allegations, dismissing them as fabricated by your media machines, and pointing to amnesty programs for political prisoners as proof of inclusivity, though international observers like Human Rights Watch have documented ongoing detentions of journalists and activists. Reactions to Traore's response have been swift and polarized. In AES countries, state media amplified the speech, with hashtags like #AESstrong and #TrumpToHell trending on local platforms. Protests in support swelled in Bamako and Niamey, where crowds waved AES flags and burned effigies of Trump. Pan-African leaders, including those from non-AES nations like Senegal and Ghana, offered muted solidarity, with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa calling for African solutions to African problems in a statement. Conversely, U.S. allies in the region, such as Côte d'Ivoire's President Alassane Ouattara, warned that Traore's rhetoric could invite escalation, urging dialogue through the African Union. On the global front, Russian President Vladimir Putin praised Traore as a true patriot in a Kremlin release, offering increased military aid to the AES. Chinese diplomats echoed this, framing the standoff as a test of multipolarity against U.S. hegemony. Back in Washington, Trump's advisors downplayed the rebuttal, with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt calling it desperate bluster from a failing regime. Analysts, however, warn of broader implications. A U.S. intervention could fracture NATO unity, as European nations like Germany hesitate amid their own energy dependencies, and spark proxy conflicts involving Wagner-linked forces. As diplomatic cables fly and military postures harden, the rhetoric from both sides underscores a deepening rift, with the Sahel poised on the edge of confrontation. Intelligence sources indicate heightened AES troop movements along borders, while U.S. reconnaissance drones have been spotted over the region. As the diplomatic storm over President Donald J. Trump's threatened military intervention in West Africa intensifies, Colonel Assimi Goïta, the 42-year-old transitional president of Mali and a founding figure of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, took to the airwaves this afternoon with an impassioned address that directly confronted the U.S. leader. Broadcast live from the Kaluba Palace amid throngs of supporters waving Malian and AES flags, Goïta's speech amplified the defiant tone set by Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traore earlier today, framing the AES as a resilient force born from betrayal and vowing fierce resistance to any foreign incursion. His words, delivered with the measured intensity of a seasoned military commander, have further galvanized regional sentiment, turning the Sahel crisis into a potential flashpoint for broader anti-Western backlash. In a 25-minute oration that blended historical reflection with fiery rhetoric, Goïta began by invoking the origins of the AES, portraying it not as a junta-led power grab but as a necessary rebirth from the ashes of failed governance. We, the AES, were formed from the heartbreaks and broken promises of our past leaders, he stated, his voice echoing through loudspeakers to crowds in Bamako's streets. He elaborated on this narrative, recounting how Mali's pre-coup era under President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, whom Goïta overthrew in 2020, was marred by corruption, electoral fraud, and ineffectual responses to the jihadist insurgency that has plagued the country since 2012. Our people endured broken promises, promises of security from leaders who hid behind French bases, promises of prosperity from puppets who sold our gold and cotton to the highest bidder, promises of democracy that meant nothing but empty ballots and full prisons for dissenters, Goita said, referencing scandals like the embezzlement of international aid funds and the controversial 2018 elections, which international observers criticized for irregularities. He positioned the 2020 and 2021 coups as corrections demanded by the masses, citing massive protests in Bamako that called for Keita's resignation as proof of popular legitimacy. Delving into the AES's formation, Goita described the alliance, announced in 2024 alongside Niger and Burkina Faso, as a brotherhood forged in the fire of betrayal. He highlighted the shared experiences of the three nations: expulsion of French forces after accusations of neo-colonial overreach, sanctions from ECOWAS that crippled economies, and the pivot to Russian and Turkish partnerships for military training and equipment. Heartbreaks from leaders who knelt to Washington and Paris, who let our youth die in the desert while foreign corporations drilled our resources dry, he said, pointing to Mali's vast mineral wealth, including gold mines operated by Canadian and Australian firms under previous regimes, which he claimed funneled profits abroad while leaving communities in poverty. Goita argued that the AES's Mutual Defense Pact and economic integration efforts, such as joint infrastructure projects and a proposed common currency, represent a genuine path to self-determination, free from the strings attached to US and EU aid packages that often come with governance conditions. Turning directly to Trump's threats, Goita issued a bold challenge, his demeanor shifting from reflective to confrontational. "We dare you to set foot on our soil," he declared, pausing for effect as cheers erupted from the audience. "If you do, you will have the whole of Mali to fight with. Not just the military, but every farmer, every teacher, every mother defending her home." He expanded on this by evoking Mali's storied history of resistance, drawing parallels to the ancient Mali Empire's warriors and the anti-colonial struggles against France in the 1950s and 1960s. Goita detailed plans for national mobilization, mentioning the recruitment of volunteer militias, a controversial tactic already in use against Islamist groups, and alliances with local ethnic groups like the Tuareg and Fulani, whose grievances with past governments have been partially addressed under AES rule. "Our military is battle-hardened from years in the sands, but the people are our true strength. They rose against your puppets. They will rise against you," he warned, citing surveys from AES-affiliated think tanks showing over 70% public approval for the juntas in urban areas, though independent polls from organizations like Afrobarometer paint a more mixed picture amid economic hardships. Goita reserved his sharpest criticism for Trump's vision of democracy, rejecting it outright as incompatible with African realities. "We don't need your type of democracy here," he asserted, dismissing US-style elections as tools of manipulation that perpetuate inequality. He delved into critiques of Western interventions, referencing the chaos following NATO's 2011 Libya operation, which he blamed for flooding the Sahel with weapons and fighters, exacerbating Mali's security crisis. "Your democracy means drones over our villages, sanctions on our markets, and leaders who answer to Wall Street, not the people," Goita said, highlighting how US support for ECOWAS has included military aid to neighboring countries, potentially positioning them as proxies in any conflict. He contrasted this with the AES's people-centered approach, including land reforms, anti-corruption drives, and youth employment programs funded by new partnerships with Russia and China, which he portrayed as equitable alternatives to exploitative Western models. The address has rippled through the region and beyond, eliciting a spectrum of responses. In Mali, spontaneous rallies formed in cities like Gao and Timbuktu, with participants chanting AES forever, and sharing Goita's quotes on social media despite intermittent internet restrictions. Niger's General Abdurrahmane Tiani issued a brief statement of solidarity, calling Goita's words the voice of the Sahel. African Union chairperson Moussa Faki Mahamat urged de-escalation in a press release, emphasizing dialogue over confrontation, while Pan-African activists on platforms like X praised the speech as a manifesto for decolonization. In contrast, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller labeled it inflammatory propaganda, reiterating Trump's claims of AES human rights abuses, including reports of extrajudicial killings and media censorship documented by Amnesty International. As satellite imagery shows increased activity at U.S. bases in neighboring countries like Mauritania and increased AES border patrols, the exchange underscores the high stakes involved. Diplomatic efforts, including back-channel talks mediated by Algeria, appear strained, with Goita's challenge adding fuel to an already volatile situation. Completing a triad of defiant addresses from the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, leaders, General Abdurrahmane Tiani, the 63-year-old head of Niger's military junta, spoke from the presidential palace this evening, rounding out the AES's collective rebuke to President Donald J. Trump's threats of U.S. intervention. In a speech broadcast across national radio and television, Tiani echoed the sentiments of his counterparts in Mali and Burkina Faso, while adding his own emphasis on Niger's strategic importance and the unbreakable solidarity of the alliance. His measured yet resolute tone, drawing on his decades of military experience, has further solidified the AES's stance, transforming what began as a U.S. policy announcement into a full-blown international standoff with echoes of Cold War-era proxy conflicts. Tiani, who seized power in a July 2023 coup against President Mohamed Bazoum, opened his 18-minute address by aligning Niger's struggle with the broader AES narrative of liberation from external dominance. "We stand shoulder to shoulder with our brothers in Mali and Burkina Faso, forged in the same crucible of resistance against those who would dictate our fate from afar," he began, acknowledging the earlier speeches by Colonel Assimi Goita and Captain Ibrahim Traore. He delved into Niger's specific grievances, portraying the pre-coup government as a vassal state beholden to Western interests, particularly in the exploitation of its uranium reserves, which supply a significant portion of Europe's nuclear fuel. "Our past leaders promised democracy but delivered dependency. Uranium flowing to your reactors while our people lacked electricity, schools, and security," Tiani said, referencing deals with French companies that he claimed undervalued Niger's resources and ignored environmental impacts, such as water contamination in mining areas like Arlit. He cited economic data from AES reports showing that under Bazoum, foreign debt ballooned to over 50% of GDP, with U.S. aid often tied to military basing rights that prioritized counterterrorism over local development. Building on this, Tiani addressed Trump's allegations of anti-democratic rule, reframing the AES as a people's compact rather than a threat. "Your accusations are the words of an empire in decline, blind to the will of sovereign nations," he stated, emphasizing that the coups were responses to public outcry against corruption and insecurity. In Niger, he pointed to the 2023 protests against Bazoum's handling of the Boko Haram insurgency spillover from Nigeria, which displaced thousands in the Diffa region. "The people rose because your version of democracy meant endless poverty and foreign troops on our soil, French, American, whoever paid the bills," Tiani argued, noting the expulsion of U.S. drone bases in Agadez after the coup, which he described as surveillance outposts masquerading as anti-terror operations. He highlighted AES successes in Niger, including joint border patrols that reduced cross-border attacks by 15% according to internal military assessments, and new economic ties with Turkey and the UAE for infrastructure, bypassing what he called predatory Western loans from institutions like the IMF. Tiani then escalated his rhetoric, directly challenging Trump's intervention plans and underscoring the AES's preparedness for confrontation. "If you dare to cross our borders, you will face not just Niger's army, but the unyielding spirit of a united Sahel," he warned, detailing Niger's military capabilities honed from years of fighting Islamist groups in the Lake Chad Basin. He spoke of mobilizing reserves, including youth volunteers and alliances with nomadic communities, to create a total defense strategy. "We have learned from your wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Quick victories turn to quagmires when the people stand firm," Tiani said, invoking historical U.S. setbacks to question the feasibility of Trump's swift operation. He criticized the U.S. president's motives, suggesting they stem from a desire to secure uranium supplies amid global energy shifts, especially with Russia's control over alternative sources. "Your threats are not about democracy. They're about control, controlling our resources, our alliances, our future. But the AES is unbreakable. We choose partners like Russia and China because they build without strings, not bomb without cause." Delving into the philosophical underpinnings of the AES, Tiani positioned the alliance as a model for African Renaissance, rejecting Western democratic templates as culturally mismatched. "We build a democracy rooted in our soil, not imported from your capitals," he explained, advocating for consultative assemblies and community-led governance over multi-party elections, which he argued foster division in fragile states. He referenced Niger's post-coup reforms, such as anti-corruption tribunals that recovered millions in embezzled funds and agricultural initiatives that boosted millet production in drought-prone areas. Tiani also addressed human rights concerns raised by Trump, dismissing them as selective outrage. Where was your concern when your allies in ECOWAS blockaded our borders, starving our people? Or when drones killed civilians in the name of precision? He questioned, citing reports from local NGOs about collateral damage from pre-coup U.S. strikes. The speech culminated in a call for Pan-African unity, urging other nations to reject neo-colonial policing and support the AES against aggression. To President Trump and his envoys, your era of dictation is over. The Sahel awakens, and Africa watches, Tiani concluded, as the broadcast cut to images of AES flags waving in Niamey's squares. With Tiani's address capping the AES leaders' responses, the crisis has reached a critical juncture, exposing fault lines in international relations. Protests have spread beyond the Sahel to cities like Dakar and Addis Ababa, with African youth movements amplifying anti-intervention messages on social media. The United Nations Security Council has scheduled an emergency session for tomorrow, where veto-wielding powers Russia and China are expected to block any U.S.-backed resolutions. In Washington, Trump tweeted a brief dismissal, weak words from weak leaders. America first means protecting democracy everywhere. Stay tuned. Meanwhile, Pentagon sources confirm advanced planning for potential operations, though congressional Democrats push for a vote under the War Powers Resolution. As markets react with volatility, uranium futures spiking 8% and African currencies dipping, the world braces for what could evolve into a proxy war or, optimistically, a diplomatic breakthrough. For now, the AES stands united, its leaders' voices resonating as a challenge to U.S. hegemony, while the Sahel's fate hangs in the balance between sovereignty and intervention. This developing story underscores the complexities of global power dynamics in an increasingly multipolar world, with no clear resolution in sight.